If you're writing your resume, there's certain things that you're going to want to leave off of it. Stick around because I'm going to tell you what they are. Hey everybody, it's Brian from A Life After Layoff, and today I want to share with you some resume writing tips. But before we get too far into it, if you're interested in more career-related content directly from a corporate recruiter, make sure you hit that subscribe button. All right, so let's talk about resume writing. When you're writing your resume, there are certain things that you're going to want to include and also not include if you want to stand out from the crowd. Keep in mind that resume is crucially important in a tight labor market because it's the first impression that we make on the recruiter and the hiring team. So we want to make sure we've got a clean, concise, well-crafted resume to stand out from the crowd. So as a recruiter, I want to share with you some mistakes that I see people consistently making on their resumes and how you can avoid them yourself. So the first thing to avoid when you're writing a resume is you don't want to include any bright graphics or colors. Now, I'm okay with some color in the resume if you want to put a job title as a different color. In fact, that's what I teach in Resume Rocketfuel. So just stick to blues, blacks. You might be able to get away with a magenta. Just keep it nice and simple. And the reason why we don't want to use any bright colors on our resume is we want to keep it as clean and concise, and we don't want to distract the interviewer from the task at hand, which is assessing your background to ensure that you're the best fit for that role. And while we're at it, we want to avoid any graphs or charts or any clip art. Keep in mind that your resume is a professional document, and unfortunately, you will be judged if you include too much colorful stuff, even though you might think it's cute and shows personality. The only time that I would recommend that you include any graphs, any charts, any graphics that might be unique and splashy is if you're in a creative field. So if you're an art director, you're a graphic designer, then the expectation would probably be that you would have something like that on your resume to show your creativity. However, for just about every other career type, keep it simple and safe. You don't want to try to go bold on this particular document. The same goes for infographics, and I see a lot of people will use cute infographics to demonstrate how proficient they are at a certain skill. So they'll put a little graphic there that shows that they've got 4 or 5 bars checked for a certain skill. In fact, people tend to think that that sells how proficient they are. However, if you're identifying that you're only a 3 out of a 10 on a particular skill, it's actually showing me, the recruiter, and potentially even the hiring manager, that you're actually weak on a skill that might be important to us. So you don't want to call that out in a resume, because you could eliminate yourself with that infographic without you even realizing it. It's better to let us assess it in the interview process, and if that's a particularly in-demand skill by the employer, take note of it, and if you're a 3 out of 10, then maybe you should work on trying to up that skill level before you start. So we want to be as vague as possible in that regard. However, we don't want to lie on our resume and misrepresent skills that we don't truly have. The next thing you should avoid is having columns, because when you have multiple columns on your resume, what generally happens is an ATS system parses left to right, and most of them are pretty sophisticated and they will be able to parse different formats pretty well, but I have seen them have some difficulty reading columns. So if you list out all of your skills in these columns, you have multiple rows. I have seen ATS systems only be able to read the first column, and therefore all the other skills might be invisible. And this is particularly important if you're uploading to an ATS system that parses all that out and creates a word bank. Or if a recruiter goes in later and does some sourcing on the ATS system at a later date. So say you apply for a job, you don't get it, but a year from now, the recruiter goes back into the ATS system and does a Boolean search. They may be actually able to find you based on those keywords. And if you only have 1 column worth of skills that are showing up, you might actually be missing those keywords that they'd be searching for, and you could be invisible. We always want to be as discoverable as possible, so it's a simple fix. Just get rid of the columns altogether. The next thing that we want to avoid is photographs of ourselves. Now, this is country specific. I'm talking primarily in the US or North America, although I do believe it is relatively common in Mexico. We don't want somebody to judge us. For me as a recruiter, when I see a resume that comes with a photograph, I almost automatically assume that they are not based in the US. And this is particularly important for those of you who are outside of the US and trying to get work in the United States. However, you're located in an area of the world where the photograph is a common thing, then do what's customary and make sure that you're consistent. And the next thing you want to avoid on your resume is anything that has personal identifiers. So you don't want to put what gender you are, what race you are, what creed you are, what color you are, what marital status. I have actually seen people write that they're married with 2 kids. You don't want to put any of that stuff in there because, again, we're trying to eliminate any decisions made on us that are not work related. And whether or not you have kids could be used against you by an unscrupulous employer. And unfortunately, I would say it probably does happen. So let's not give them any reason to screen us out based on that stuff. Just omit anything that has a personal identifier that in particular is a protected class. So there's a law against it. don't include it on your resume. Don't give low-hanging fruit for an employer to discriminate. Now, again, this tip is US specific. So if in your country, these are common things to include, then follow the local tradition. But I would try to avoid putting any more detail than you need to regarding things that are not work related. The next thing to avoid is unprofessional email addresses. And I still scratch my head because I have seen some of the most colorful email addresses, and I sit there and think to myself, like, do they not feel that this is appropriate? Like, I usually partyboy28@yahoo.com. So if you created an email address that dates back to your college years and you weren't thinking much about it, it's probably a good opportunity for you to just go and create a Gmail account with your full name or some moniker that is relatively neutral. I would avoid any nicknames or anything that's going to potentially discriminate against you. But let's not give the hiring manager any reason to potentially judge you or make assumptions about you. So just create a clean email address. The next thing that you should avoid is full addresses. That's no longer needed in a resume. All we need to know is what city and state you are. Number one, we don't need to know where you live. We're not going to send you any mail or stop by your house. Number two, we don't want to give the employer any reason to discriminate against your application. So like, I'm thinking distances. If you live on one side of a city and you're applying to a job that's on the other side and you think that the commute is reasonable, however, maybe they had somebody in that role that just quit because of the long commute, and now that hiring manager is particularly sensitive to people who have over 45-minute commutes, and they screen you out based on that. And I've seen that actually happen, and it's unfortunate. Of course, we don't want hiring managers making assumptions about candidates without them confirming. But if you avoid putting the specific location, just put the city or the state, and you don't even have to be specific. If you live on the south side of Minneapolis, you could just put Minneapolis. You don't have to be specific about the individual town. I'll also say that if you are a remote worker, people will say, well, I don't need to include the address there. And that's actually not true. Recruiters still want to see what city and state you're located on because it could be particularly important for time zones. So if you're based in East Coast and you're supporting a West Coast group, there is a few hour time difference that you need to be aware of, and that might be a deciding factor. And there's also certain geographic regions that you have to be located in order to qualify for certain jobs. Thinking taxation issues, the company has to be set up to do business in that area. And this is particularly important or particularly true if you are living in another country. You can't live in Brazil, for example, and apply for a US-based position. You still have to go through the proper protocol, and that company has to be set up to do business in Brazil to be able to hire you that way. The next thing we want to avoid is any work history that's not relevant or that is over 10 years old. And in general, an employer is going to bias on your last 10 years of work, and probably even more recently than that, the last 5 years in particular. And in general, anything older than 10 years, the skills that you maybe had during that job are no longer relevant. The market changes, etc. So that stuff really isn't as important. And unless you're trying to apply for a job that specifically states they need 20 years of experience, which I have yet to find one unless it's a senior executive position, then you don't need to include this long, elaborate work history. And taking that a step further, we also want to avoid putting any industry-specific jargon into our jobs. So if job titles, any acronyms, if I as the recruiter wouldn't know what the acronym or the jargon is outside of your company, then there's a good chance that other hiring managers wouldn't either. So we want to leave that stuff off because it's too specific and it's not helping you with discoverability. And besides, we don't want hiring managers to have to work harder to try to figure out what exactly it is that you do. We want to make it as clear as possible so it gives you the better chance of getting hired. The next few deal with education. And one thing that I see pretty frequently is people will give too much information and too much detail about their degrees. And in particular, I don't need to know what college you went to or courses you studied. For example, if you went to Penn State's business school, I don't need you to spell it that you went to Schmiel. You can just say Penn State and then the degree type that you got. Same thing goes for minor degrees. Employers don't weight minors all that heavily. It's a nice keyword to get on your resume, but I wouldn't waste a whole lot of real estate trying to convince somebody of all the courses that you studied. Unless, of course, you're entry level. In that case, you might want those extra keywords to just show that you're a better fit for that first job out of college. Now, the same thing goes for your grade point average. If you're somebody that's more than 3 years out of college, I wouldn't even bother putting your GPA on there. Employers really don't care. We're not going to ask you about it unless you get to a certain point in your career. You may have one or two hiring managers that might ask you about it, but in general, it's not a common thing, and you could just offer it when you're in the interview with them. Now, if you're entry level or you've got less than 3 years of total work experience, then I would keep that GPA in there, but plan to drop it off your resume once you hit that experience threshold. Same thing goes for internships. If you've been in the workforce for longer than 3 years, you can drop those internships from your resume. We're not including them as total years of experience, and so they're just really there for vanity stats. The next thing that you can avoid, and I see this very frequently in resumes, is listing out actual references or saying references available upon request. We don't need to see that. If I'm going to ask you for references, I'll just ask you for references. I'm not going to go onto your resume and call up any references that you have unless you give me permission to do so. And besides, I feel like employers are starting to get away from references. There are still some old school ones that do it. I probably check references 5% of the time, or 5% of the employers. Maybe there's some employers out there that are still doing them. But in general, I feel like that's more antiquated, and we don't need you to spell out that your references are available on request. We just assume so. And let's talk salary for a minute. I have seen some people submitting their resumes with salary history and how much they made at each job. And you absolutely don't want to include your previous salary history unless you want to be locked into the salary that you've been providing, because you're basically disclosing all of that. And if an employer has a much healthier range and they see that they can get you cheaper, you're just opening yourself up to a possible lowball offer. It's not worth it. We'll ask you that in your first round interview, so I wouldn't even bother putting that in. So avoid listing anything related to what your compensation or what your expected compensation is. The last two items in today's video are related to skills. The first one is using universal or generic skills. The first one that comes to mind is Microsoft Word. It's been the industry standard for longer than most of us have been in the workplace. And it's pretty much assumed that in any professional level job, you're going to have experience with those basic packages. So the Excel, the Word, the PowerPoint. So I wouldn't necessarily waste valuable real estate on those universal skills that everybody probably has. Instead, I'll allow the recruiter to ask me that in the interview if they really need to know that I have that skill. The same thing goes for leadership and organization skills. You'd be better off just including them in your resume bullet points and showing that you have the competency by demonstrating it. The last thing I want to talk about is using generic fluff or cliche jargon. And these are commonly things like I'm a team player or I'm a fast learner, anything that is generic and cliche, because there's nobody out there that's going to admit that they're not a team player or that they aren't a quick learner. It literally does no good in your resume. I have yet to encounter a hiring manager who said, oh, look, they're a quick learner. So I just avoid it and save your real estate for something that's a little bit more meaty. But if you found your way to this video, I'm going to assume that you're looking to learn how to write a better resume. Because here's the thing, if you're applying to job after job and you're not getting a lot of bites on your resume and assuming you're reasonably qualified for the positions that you're applying to, it's almost always a resume issue. So you want to make sure that your resume is well optimized for the recruitment teams. If you're not sure how to do that, I actually created a course called Resume Rocketfuel. Resume Rocketfuel teaches you step-by-step how to write a resume that is going to give you the best chance of getting noticed by recruiters in order to get your foot in the door and into that first round interview. But not only is it going to teach you how to write the resume, it's also more importantly going to teach you how to use it strategically to give you the best chance to stand out from the competition around you. And once you get that first round interview, it is up to you to sell yourself throughout the rest of the interviewing process. And that's where the Ultimate Job Seeker Bootcamp comes in. It's going to take you through each step of that interview process, ultimately give you the tips, the tools, the techniques that you need to land your dream offer. The nice thing about it is we can usually get your investment back through some good negotiation techniques that we teach you in that course. And if you want to skip the recruiter altogether and move right into the interviewing process, you want to learn how to use LinkedIn. If you're not getting a lot of outreach from recruiters who are soliciting you for relevant opportunities, then you want to really leverage that tool. And I created a course called Unlocking LinkedIn, which is going to teach you how to set up your profile and how to use the tool to network correctly to get the best positions. And that's going to be the real rocket fuel in your job search. So make sure you check that one out as well. I'll leave a link below. I know that resume writing can be pretty daunting, especially in a difficult labor market where you're trying to compete with thousands of other people. So you really do need any advantage that you can get. And that's why I created this channel. That's why I created my website, alifeafterlayoff.com. However, if you're somebody that's really struggling and need a little bit more personalized help, I do offer some private one-on-one coaching sessions. So you can hit me up through my website for those as well. Hey, appreciate you watching. Happy resume writing and good luck on that job search. We'll see you next time.